All right, and welcome all to our second session of this Attune virtual convention. My name is Julie, she, her pronouns. I am with Richmond Tenants Union in Richmond, Virginia. And I will be just doing a quick intro here to kind of take us through what to expect in our next session. And we'll be taking stack during our discussion after the presentations this afternoon. So we'll hear from two groups today, both on case studies in neighborhood crisis response. We'll first hear from Amadi, May, and Francis from Crown Heights Tenant Union in Brooklyn, New York. We will hear about how neighbors convened in solidarity with a neighbor who is being harassed by the building owner and his associates. The panel will offer will offer a model for organizing in small unit buildings owned by mom and pop landlords. They'll also discuss lessons from cross-coalition communication, working with the press, staging a rally under high-risk conditions, and managing rapid response networks. They'll also reflect on approaches to collective leadership, naming boundaries, and identifying roles for neighbors with different experiences and skills. Second, we will hear from HAND, Housing and Neighborhood Defense in Eugene, Oregon, who will be sharing lessons from the Almaden eviction defense. They'll be reflecting on a rent strike and eviction defense that took place in summer 2023, what went well, what they struggled with, and how they're putting lessons into practice now. They'll talk a bit about demonstrations that went on at the management office and eviction defense against police. With that, I'll pass it off to our Crown Heights Tenant Union folks. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here.
Hey guys, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. One second. Okay. Can you guys see that? Can you see that? No, not yet. Yes. Okay, good. Start slideshow. Hey guys, so I'm Amadi. Francis and May are also on the call. I don't know how, we don't have the most time, so we'll just get right into it. So this is going to be a talk about neighborhood crisis response, and I think it's especially useful. One piece of context, I think, is that, so we had called this like tenant solidarity work when you're like a tenant helping another tenant through their own issue with their landlord. And this is like the first kind of tenant solidarity thing that May ever did, like as a member of the Crown Tenant Union. And it was a kind of pretty complicated and big situation. And that's all to say that like there's a lot of like transferable soft skills that like any renter, any tenant can activate in order to like help with something like this. Like you don't have to be like an expert on anything. So I think that's maybe the main takeaway from this talk. Okay. We're going to go through some background on the situation. Then we're going to reflect on some of our key lessons, our key takeaways from this experience. And then we're going to go through a few skills that I think were useful for this campaign, cross-coalition communication, rapid response networks, and staging a rally. We also have some materials on working with the press, but we don't have time to talk about them. But we'll also have time in the Q&A as well. Okay. So this is about Francis Roberts, who lives in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. He lived there for 25 years. He was formerly a superintendent for some time. He's a Black tenant on Park Place, which is this kind of like gentrifying avenue in Crown Heights. It's a Parkside brownstone apartment. There's like one apartment and the rest of the building is like these single room occupancy units, right? Most of them are vacant. It's like a gentrifying neighborhood Francis's rent was like $450. I think the building as a whole was valued at something like $1.3 million at the time that it was sold to its current landlord, Yehuda Gruenberg. So there's like a lot of tension, I think, already on the block. And over the years, Francis has refused buyout offers and quasi buyout offers from many parties. Um,
Hello, I'm May. Thank you, Amadi, for introing us and having me. And Francis, hopefully you can come off video at some point and also contribute a bit. So as Amadi said, this was my first real organizing experience with CHGU, and I owe so much to Amadi. And also, I'm seeing that Jess and Zara are on here as well. They were invaluable in, jumpstarting this organizing and helping Francis stay in his home. So just to get into the timeline, in April 2022, goons is like really the best way to describe these people who moved into the building and into these tent encampments outside. You can see the tent in that photo. And we're using a lot of different methods that we'll describe later to attempt to bully Francis out of his home. Throughout the summer, tensions were only rising. A lot of the neighbors were being impacted as well. The block is very quintessentially Crown Heights, which is that it has a lot of long-term tenants who've been there a while, maybe who've been there with their families for decades, and then a lot of newer tenants who are mostly moving into renovated apartments. And that is a huge thing that in Crown Heights we're dealing with, is the very quick gentrification happening, and we were definitely seeing it on the block. So this was everyone on the block was being affected by this, and neighbors, by the end of the summer, things had gotten so sort of extreme that that a lot of the neighbors came together to send the landlord a demand letter. Some people were taking matters into their own hands and working to break down the tent encampment by force. I think next slide. We will say more about what makes them goons. So September, actually there had been a dormant block association on this block, and it was reinvigorated by all of this. So September they had their first meeting. Francis filed a lawsuit against his landlord for harassment and urgent repairs. The repairs were part of the harassment campaign in October. In November, the Crown Heights Tenant Union and Crown Heights Care Collective, which Amadi is part of, Amadi's part of both, but worked to organize a rally in front of Francis's building, which ended with 150 plus people being there. Coincidentally, the porta potties and tent encampment were removed the night before the rally. So that was a huge win just in the publication of the rally, pressuring the landlord to do something. And then there was a very, very slow court case that made its way through the court. By May, this judge, who's known to be a very anti-tenant judge, found a judgment of no fault to the landlord, despite describing the harassment as some of the worst she's ever seen in her career. Okay, next slide. So the harassment itself, this is a very incomplete list, but there were a lot of very urgent repairs that weren't being addressed. There was mold, various leaks. There was a leak in the kitchen that was sort of inexplicable, that would just pour this like green goo into Francis's apartment. There was faulty electrical wiring, other structural issues. There was an instance when someone who's known to possibly live in the upstairs unit had broken into Francis's apartment while he was there. They grilled food in his entryway. They were like barbecuing next to his bedroom window. The tents were blocking his entrance to his apartment. The porta potties near the entrance at one point were overturned and were leaking excrement all over the front of the property and the sidewalk adjacent to it. There was loud music playing 24/7. that Francis could hear very loudly in his apartment. And additionally, at some point, there were some live chickens on the front porch. Trash. There was one point when Francis couldn't get out of his apartment because trash had been like thrown all in the hallway that leads to his door. Um, there was a noose that was at one point found on a tree in front of Francis's property. And again, this is not a complete list, and we will give some links for stories that came out of this so you can read more. Oh yeah, so those are the stories, and we'll link to them.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, May. So I would say, are we kind of just tried to distill this into three key lessons? The first being about like making representational demands. So Francis isn't like a unionized tenant, like his building can't really be unionized. He's mainly the only tenant. There were some shorter term tenants, but they all left during this. And so it's not like a typical tenant association story. So I guess one of the questions we had to ask ourselves is like, why were we getting involved in this in the first place? I think one of the things that was important to us was like drawing attention to the fact that Francis is not alone, that this kind of harassment, like targeted harassment of elders is pretty commonplace. Tens of thousands of elderly New Yorkers experience this kind of harassment from landlords who are just trying to push them out of the property so that they can charge a much higher rate for them. So we wanted to use Francis's story to draw attention to a broader pattern of something that was happening in New York. And this is like a clear pattern that people understood, like on the block itself, like the neighbors knew that in the previous year, there had been like another high profile attempted displacement of a long-term Black residents. So neighbors recognized that this was part of a broader pattern, right? And so we wanted to send a message, right? We wanted to send a message to the landlords, like the people who thought that they could really get away with this kind of stuff. We wanted to send a message to impacted tenants, either people who are experiencing harassment like this. And we were able to get in touch with more tenants who are experiencing this kind of harassment in Crown Heights through the canvassing that we did for this. And we also wanted to draw the attention to this for non-impacted tenants, because sometimes it feels like non-impacted tenants don't understand what we mean when we say harassment, what we mean when we say a landlord is refusing repairs, et cetera. Like they don't know how deep the rabbit hole goes. So we wanted to draw attention to all of that. So ultimately this like became like one of the biggest stories of the year. It was published in Brownstoner, that was who broke it. New York Times also had an article. It was kind of like, it was kind of on the cover. It was under the fold on New York Times, but it was the most clicked on article on the New York Times website that quarter. Because people care about stuff like this. And it's a pretty ridiculous story. So that's the first thing, is representational demands. I noted that Francis might want to speak. Maybe not.
Francis, if you're back at your computer, just unmute when you have a minute. Oh, there you are. Hi, Francis. If you try unmuting the audio, we can't hear you quite yet.
Yeah, you're still muted. Yeah, got
Okay,
it.
yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know what sort of comment you want from me at this juncture.
Francis, I think if you could speak to the piece about community involvement and support and why that was important in a case like yours.
Well, my case, as those who are familiar with the actual court proceedings and who live on the block would know, was a very egregious one. As a matter of fact, as May said the judge commented that in all her years on the bench, it is the worst case of harassment that she had encountered. Indeed, it was so bad that reporters came in from the New York Times, the Channel 12 News. It was on a local news network. There were articles also in the Bronx Stoner, and there were inquiries from other organizations that were interested in landlord-tenant issues. My case started about 7 years ago when the building was passed as part of a legal maneuver to a gentleman who couldn't pay the mortgage, sorry. And it eventually ended up under the city's 7A administration program, which meant that someone was appointed by the court to administer the building. And that in itself engendered additional problems because the 7A started to do work that was unnecessary. And eventually, it meant that we didn't have any gas in the building. And we had to go to the court system, which could not rectify the problem because of what the 7A administrator had done. And this went on for a time, and most of the tenants left until there were just two tenants. That's myself on the basement apartment and tenants on the first floor. Eventually, the tenants on the first floor would offer a buyout by the landlord, which they took. And for note, that is now forbidden by the city. There is a legislative law that sort of precludes that sort of arrangement now.
Mhm.
But then that meant that I was the last person in the building. And in order to get me out, the landlord applied for what is known as a non-harassment certificate, which means that if you could certify as a landlord that you did not harass the tenant, then the city would issue that certificate. And if the building is not a landmark building, then the landlord could then proceed to do whatever he figures with the building. And that was the strategy that was used to get me out of the building. But luckily, the city department, housing and preservation, came onto the case, and they were willing to prove to the court that not only was there harassment of me in particular, but also harassment on the remaining tenant who lived on the first floor.
Mhm.
So then
Well,
they,
and I think, Francis, I'm sorry to cut you off. Just I know that we're pretty short on time, but
mhm,
I think also one of the things that we learned through this process was, the court piece is very important, and going through all those processes to make sure that the city is aware of what's going on and doing everything they can to make your apartment livable and allow you to keep you in your apartment. That really it was the neighborhood coming together around you and insisting that you not be displaced that ultimately was what seemed to work in this case from my vantage point. I don't know if you disagree with that.
well, from that vantage point, the Crown Heights Tenants Union was critical in garnering the support of the community, not only uh, the aspect of drawing attention to it, but also from the aspect of providing me with a rapid response unit connection.
Yeah.
Because you have to realize that during the struggle, there were tenants, well, not tenants, they were occupants in the front entranceway, which a lot of you probably have seen the tents that were erected there. And also there were nefarious activities, not only in the yard, but in my entranceway. And after my apartment was broken into, then it became necessary to reach out for some sort of help. And the rapid response unit of the Crown Heights Tenants Union
Mhm.
was very
Yeah.
effective in providing me with not only protection, but someone or a contact that I could call, which I had to use on several occasions. Not only when I was threatened by some of these vagans that were allowed to live in my hallway entrance, but
Mhm.
also when they started a barbecue and a fire outside my apartment window. I mean,
And Francis, sorry, sorry to cut you off. I
yeah.
know we're short on time. I think we're gonna get into the rapid response bit slightly later, but Amadi, did you have a little more you wanted to say on the key lessons?
Yeah, I mean, let me dive quickly through this part, and then maybe we can just skip to talking about cross-coalition communication and rapid response, because I think we have maybe about 10 minutes left. But yeah, the other two things that we'd wanted to talk about were collective leadership and inside agitators. So just making sure that everyone on the block knew that nobody was like an expert in the situation, that we're all figuring it out, and that everybody was able to contribute something to supporting Francis, and that Francis himself was at the center of any decisions that we made about what was going to happen on the block or in the neighborhood. And the other thing, which is we, in order to build this rapid response network that Francis was talking about, it was important to us that we like connected activist types to like neighbors on the block, so like that people who lived on the block were participating in every single aspect of the action, from like high risk red level action to, you know, the low risk green level stuff. So that was important to us. So we kind of like used a buddy system so that people who lived on the block knew what we were doing at all times, basically. Um, let's dive into a couple of skill shares. So we had like 4 prepped, but we're only going to go through 2 of them. We're going to talk first about cross-coalition communication, and then we're going to talk about rapid response networks. Okay, so there were a lot of people involved just in general. There were many, many organizations, the Crown Heights Tenant Union, Crown Heights Care Collective. There are people from like Crown Heights Mutual Aid. There are people from Clean Up Crown Heights, which is like a neighborhood cleanup group. I could keep listing people, but there were just a lot of people, and it was a really complicated situation. So it was important for us to be able to name our organizational boundaries. So there are questions that you ask yourself as an organization, like, you know, what is needed in this situation? Who will do what? Who can do what is my organization willing to do? And will victory be declared, right? When will the campaign be over? When will the organization pull back? And you'll also ask yourself questions as an individual, like, you know, what are your abilities? What are you comfortable with? What you can commit to? What you can offer? And also like knowing when will you have to take a step back. You know, I had to take a step back at multiple times in the campaign. May took a step back. Francis took a step back. Everybody has to take a break, you know. So being able to name that for yourself. Um, there are like 4 main criteria that people use to think through organizational boundaries. The first being like cost, meaning like price, how much this will cost and who will pay for it. Resources and competencies, meaning who has the skills to be able to do the thing that you need done. Span of influence and existing relationships. So the kinds of connections that people have. So the Crown Heights Tenant Union had particular kinds of relationships with politicians that would have been useful in this case. And identity. So like who we are as an organization, and why does that and how does that define our willingness to engage with this, that, or the other, right? And again, these boundaries were constantly restated publicly, like written down organizationally, and they were renegotiated as the situation changed. So like we were very, very clear about like what we as an organization were going to do and why we were going to do it and when we were going to stop doing it. Right? We also came up with community agreements, which I won't go into too much detail about. Some important ones were like not expecting the police to help, not engaging with the people who were like living in the building, like recording them, but like not making sure they did not physically touch anybody. It was important because like, I won't go through that. We also did multiple communication channels, which May's going to talk through a little bit more when we talk about rapid response channels. And then we also held like mass meetings and stuff. So we did a lot of like regular canvassing on the block to invite people to these regular meetings, to talk about goals, talk about how it was impacting people, stuff like that. And then the other thing, this is called like pod mapping, which is when you like ask yourself what kinds of connections you want to employ at a certain point. So like sometimes during the campaign, I'd like ask Francis, like who, if something happened, if this happened, who would you want there? If this happened, who would you want to know? Who would you not want to know? What would you want us to do, etc. So asking those sorts of questions in advance, so that you can get a sense of how people were like relating to each other and who got what information. Okay.
Okay, so I'll very quickly go through the rapid response network system that we landed on. So as I said in the chat, there was a huge safety concern tied into all of this because one of the people who was living elsewhere in the building that Francis lives in was known to be dangerous. He had been arrested on gun charges in the past. And so this was something that we had to be really careful about. And also the tensions were very high on the block by the time the fall came around. And we just needed to make sure that people were going to be safe and that Francis himself also, of course, was going to be safe. So a big thing in this was establishing goals and community agreements. So one of the main, some of the main directives were like making sure the court support was available every time Francis went to court. There was always a group of us there, hopefully in like Crown Heights Senate Union shirts. The goal also was anytime something happened, it would be, sometimes it was late at night and some ruckus was going on and people felt unsafe. If Francis or someone else pinged our, signal group, we were able to, get enough people in that group and have enough engagement that 30 people would arrive on the property within 15 minutes of Francis saying there was a situation there. So I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. There were multiple communication channels. There were WhatsApp signals. There was a mailing list. We tried to communicate with people in the way that they were familiar with, especially neighbors on the block who weren't plugged into tenant organizing before. We were considering safety and privacy with those channels. We had side channels for sensitive information and also when people were working on specific things that not everyone needed to be involved in. We had a Google form that would put people on our mailing list, and we understood that was a little bit less secure, and so we were careful what to put in email. And then establishing roles. Some people were most comfortable just sort of being on the outside saying like, I saw the main harasser doing XYZ, taking photos, videos, which were important later, for Francis to be able to go to court for this. There were people who were more into like amplification and outreach, whether that's door knocking on the block for the rally or making sure people were there for court support, press outreach, all of that. And then there were people who were willing to be a bit more agitative on Francis's behalf, and also others who were there to de-escalate and buffer to make sure things didn't get out of hand. A big thing in this was just, it really did build community. I know a lot more of my neighbors now, thanks to this, even though, ideally it wouldn't be something like this that makes us get to know each other. But yeah, the gatekeeping piece is just about making sure that, people only signed up for rapid response in person. We were meeting all the people who were ending up in that space because there was, again, like I said, a security issue. Okay.
Okay, cool. That's pretty much it. We have some other materials in the slides that we could just share the slides. We have some stuff on how to write your press release, how to organize a rally. This rally had like 150 or so people, and it was a little high risk because of like this situation, because it was at Francis's house, which was a site of tension. Here are some pictures. And we also wrote a zine. That's why we decided not to do the second two skill shares. We wrote a zine called How to Stage a Rally, which gives a little bit more information about like the steps and materials for writing a press release and stuff like that. And then also like all of the checklist of items and timeline and stuff for planning a rally. Okay. So that's it, I think, right? Okay, so we'll pass it over to Hand. Thank you so much.